The distant thunder of artillery echoed across the rolling Pennsylvania countryside on that fateful morning of July 1st, 1863. Major General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia marched confidently northward, their footsteps heavy with determination and their hearts buoyed by recent victories. What began as a search for shoes in a small market town would become the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil, a 3-day crucible that would forever alter the course of a nation torn asunder. General Lee had made a bold decision weeks earlier. After his stunning victory at Chancellorsville, he convinced Confederate President Jefferson Davis that an invasion of the North could bring the Union to the negotiating table. The South needed a decisive victory on Northern soil, one that might convince foreign powers like Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy, and perhaps force President Abraham Lincoln to sue for peace. The Union forces were demoralized after consecutive defeats, and Lee seized upon this opportunity to take the war to Northern territory, notes Civil War historian James McPherson in his seminal work, Battle Cry of Freedom. No Confederate army had penetrated so far north, and the psychological impact of this advance cannot be overstated. As Lee's 75,000 men moved through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, panic spread throughout the North. Harrisburg, Philadelphia, and even Washington, D.C. seemed vulnerable. The newly appointed commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, Major General George Gordon Meade, had been in command for just 3 days when he learned of Confederate forces converging near the small crossroads town of Gettysburg. What neither general anticipated was that their advance units would collide almost by accident. Confederate General Henry Heth's division had marched toward Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st, believing only local militia defended the town. Instead, they encountered elements of Union Brigadier General John Buford's cavalry division, who had arrived just a day earlier and recognized the strategic importance of the high ground south of town. Buford, a grizzled veteran with keen tactical sense, positioned his 4,000 dismounted cavalrymen along McPherson's Ridge west of town. As dawn broke on that summer morning, his pickets spotted the approaching Confederate column along the Chambersburg Pike. The seasoned officer knew he faced a superior force, but was determined to hold until infantry reinforcements arrived. "Hold until the First Corps arrives," Buford reportedly told his officers. "If we can do that, we can hold the high ground." As the morning mist cleared, Heth's Confederates deployed in battle lines across from Buford's outnumbered troopers. At approximately 9 o'clock, the first shots rang out. Union cavalry carbines cracked in response to Confederate muskets, and the Battle of Gettysburg, a confrontation neither army had planned, began in earnest. Major General John Reynolds, commanding the Union First Corps, rode ahead of his men upon hearing the gunfire. Upon arriving at Buford's position, he famously declared, "We will fight them here," before sending urgent messages to accelerate the march of his approaching infantry. Reynolds would not live to see the afternoon, felled by a Confederate bullet, while directing troops at the edge of McPherson's woods. By midday, both armies were rushing toward Gettysburg from all directions. The initial skirmish had escalated into a major engagement with thousands of troops converging on the small Pennsylvania town. Union Major General Oliver Howard's 11th Corps took position north of town, while Confederate Lieutenant General Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps approached from the northeast. Fighting intensified throughout the afternoon as more units arrived on the battlefield. Initially, the Union forces held their ground against mounting Confederate pressure, but as Confederate forces continued to arrive in greater numbers, the tide began to turn. By late afternoon, the Union lines north and west of town began to buckle under relentless Confederate attacks. What followed was a chaotic retreat through the streets of Gettysburg as Union soldiers sought the safety of Cemetery Hill south of town. The narrow streets became clogged with panicked men, wagons, and artillery. Thousands were captured in the town itself. By evening, the Union position appeared precarious, but a defensive line was forming along Cemetery Ridge and Culp's Hill, high, ground that would prove crucial in the days to come. As night fell on July 1st, Lee had won the day but missed an opportunity. His subordinate, General Ewell, hesitated to attack Cemetery Hill if practicable, interpreting Lee's discretionary order conservatively. This decision would haunt the Confederate cause in the days ahead. Dawn broke on July 2nd with both armies, fully deployed across the rolling Pennsylvania landscape. The Union Army had established a defensive position resembling a fishhook, running south along Cemetery Ridge before hooking east across Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. Meade had arrived overnight and quickly recognized the tactical advantage of this terrain. After consulting with his generals in a candlelit council of war at the Leicester House, he decided to stay and fight defensively. Lee, surveying the battlefield from Seminary Ridge, formulated an ambitious plan: simultaneous attacks against both flanks of the Union line. Lieutenant General James Longstreet's First Corps would assault the Union left at Little Round Top and the nearby wheat field, while Ewell's Second Corps would strike the Union right at Culp's Hill. If successful, this double envelopment would drive the Union Army from its commanding position. But the day began with delay. Longstreet, Lee's old warhorse, harbored serious reservations about attacking entrenched Union forces on high ground. He had advocated for a strategic maneuver around the Union left to force Meade to attack the Confederates on ground of their choosing. Lee, however, was committed to the assault. According to first-hand accounts compiled in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, Longstreet's reluctance translated into a sluggish deployment that consumed precious hours, notes military historian Stephen W. Sears. By the time his troops were in position, it was nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This delay proved costly. Just as Longstreet's men prepared to attack, the Union's Third Corps commander, Major General Daniel Sickles, made a fateful decision. Dissatisfied with his assigned position along Lower Cemetery Ridge, Sickles advanced his corps nearly half a mile forward to higher ground near the Peach Orchard, creating a vulnerable salient in the Union line. When Longstreet's powerful corps finally struck, they crashed into Sickles' exposed position with devastating effect. The fighting in the Peach Orchard, Wheatfield, and Devil's Den became some of the most savage of the entire war. Regiments were decimated in minutes as charge and countercharge swept across these blood-soaked fields. As the Confederate assault threatened to roll up the Union flank, attention turned to a previously overlooked hill at the southern end of Cemetery Ridge, Little Round Top. This rocky, wooded prominence dominated the entire Union line. If captured by Confederate forces, it would make the Union position untenable. By fortunate circumstance, Union Brigadier General Gouverneur K. Warren, Meade's chief engineer, noticed the hill's strategic importance and its alarming vacancy just as Longstreet's men approached. He frantically dispatched messengers to divert units to its defense. Colonel Strong Vincent's brigade of the Fifth Corps arrived moments before the Confederates. Among Vincent's regiments was the 20th Maine, commanded by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a former professor of rhetoric turned soldier. Positioned at the extreme left of the Union line, Chamberlain's men faced repeated assaults by the 15th Alabama under Colonel William C. Oates. With ammunition running low after withstanding several attacks, Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge down the hillside. His audacious maneuver surprised the exhausted Confederates, many of whom surrendered rather than face the wall of steel descending upon them. Chamberlain's defense of Little Round Top would become legendary, one of the most celebrated small unit actions in American military history. Meanwhile, on the Union right, Ewell's long-delayed attack against Culp's Hill met determined resistance. Union Major General Henry Slocum's 12th Corps had fortified the hill with extensive breastworks. Though Ewell's troops gained a foothold on the lower slopes, they could not dislodge the defenders from their commanding position. As darkness fell on the second day, both armies had suffered grievously. The Union line had bent but not broken. Lee had gained ground at terrible cost, but failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough he sought. In the fitful darkness, both sides prepared for what they knew would be the climactic third day. The morning of July 3, 1863 dawned hot and humid over the Pennsylvania countryside. The battle resumed at first light on Culp's Hill, where Union forces launched a counterattack to reclaim ground lost the previous evening. For 7 hours the woods echoed with the crash of musketry as Union forces methodically pushed Confederate troops from their hard-won positions. General Robert E. Lee, undeterred by the setbacks of the previous 2 days, formulated his most audacious plan yet. He would launch a massive frontal assault against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. If successful, This attack would split the Union Army in two, allowing his forces to defeat each half in detail. The assault would be preceded by the largest artillery bombardment yet seen on the North American continent. Lee's decision reflected both his aggressive instincts and an abiding faith in the fighting prowess of his men, explains historian Carol Reardon in her analysis, Pickett's Charge in History and Memory. Despite the counsel of his trusted lieutenant, Longstreet, who reportedly told him, "No 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position," Lee was resolute. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, over 150 Confederate cannons opened fire on the Union center. For nearly 2 hours, the earth trembled under this apocalyptic barrage. Union Artillery Chief Brigadier General Henry Hunt initially ordered his guns to respond, but then shrewdly directed many to cease fire to conserve ammunition and create the impression that Confederate fire had silenced them. Union soldiers huddled behind stone walls and hastily constructed breastworks as shells screamed overhead. The smoke became so thick that observers could barely make out the opposing lines. When the bombardment finally slackened, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. Then, from the tree line along Seminary Ridge, emerged nearly 15,000 Confederate infantrymen in parade ground formation. 3 divisions, commanded by Major General George Pickett, Brigadier General J. Johnston Pettigrew, and Major General Isaac Trimble, began the 3/4-mile march across open fields toward the Union center. Union Captain Andrew Cowan, commanding a battery on Cemetery Ridge, later recalled, "It was the most magnificent sight I ever saw. They came on as though they were on parade." The Union artillery, which had been largely silent during the latter part of the Confederate bombardment, now opened with devastating effect. Solid shot tore gaping holes in the Confederate ranks. As the gray lines came within range of canister, tin, cans filled with iron balls that turned cannons into giant shotguns, the slaughter intensified. Still, the Confederate troops pressed forward with remarkable discipline. As they approached the Union line, they broke into the rebel yell, that haunting battle cry that had unnerved Union troops in previous engagements. Union infantry rose from behind the stone wall along Cemetery Ridge and poured volleys of musket fire into the advancing mass. Despite catastrophic casualties, elements of the Confederate force, led by Brigadier General Lewis Armistead of Pickett's division, breached the stone wall at a point later known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Armistead, his hat raised high on his sword as a guide for his men, crossed the wall before falling mortally wounded, just as Union reinforcements rushed to seal the breach. For a few desperate minutes, hand-to-hand combat raged along the wall. But the Confederate breakthrough, achieved at such terrible cost, could not be sustained. Without support, the attackers were gradually overwhelmed by Union counterattacks. The retreat became a desperate affair. The once proud Confederate formations dissolved into groups of survivors making their way back across the killing ground they had crossed with such determination. Less than half of those who had started the charge returned to Seminary Ridge. Kimray, Pickett's shattered division returned. Lee rode among them, telling the survivors, "It's all my fault." He had gambled everything on a frontal assault against prepared positions and lost. The repulse of Pickett's charge marked the end of Confederate offensive operations at Gettysburg. As evening shadows lengthened across the battlefield on July 3rd, a torrential summer thunderstorm broke over Gettysburg, as if nature itself wept for the carnage wrought upon the land. The rain washed blood from the fields into crimson rivulets that flowed downhill, staining creeks and streams for miles around. 3 days of savage fighting had transformed bucolic farmland into a hellscape of broken bodies, shattered equipment, and churned earth. Major General George Meade, the victorious Union commander, faced a critical decision: whether to launch an immediate counterattack against Lee's battered army. Some of his subordinates, particularly Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, wounded during the repulse of Pickett's charge, urged aggressive action. "They are beaten," Hancock reportedly declared from his stretcher. "The moment has come to attack them." But Meade, cautious by nature and aware of how narrowly disaster had been averted, chose restraint. His army had suffered over 23,000 casualties, nearly a quarter of its strength. Many units were badly disorganized, and ammunition was running low. After a council of war with his generals at the Leicester House, Meade decided to consolidate his position and prepare for a Confederate attack that never came. The aftermath of battle presented scenes of unimaginable suffering, writes historian Drew Gilpin Faust in This Republic of Suffering. The field hospitals established in barns, churches, and private homes throughout the area were overwhelmed with the wounded. Surgeons worked without rest, their operating tables becoming islands in seas of amputated limbs. The civilian population of Gettysburg, just over 2,000 residents, found themselves hosting more than 30,000 wounded men, both Union and Confederate. Every public building and most private homes became impromptu hospitals. The townswomen tore bedsheets into bandages and cooked what food they could spare for the injured. Jenny Wade, the only civilian killed during the battle, died while baking bread for Union soldiers when a stray bullet pierced the door of her sister's house. Her death symbolized the war's intrusion into civilian life, even as it demonstrated the courage of non-combatants caught in the maelstrom. As July 4th dawned, the nation's 87th Independence Day, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia began its retreat toward Virginia. A massive wagon train of wounded stretched for 17 miles, creaking southward through mountain passes in a driving rainstorm. The Confederate withdrawal was hampered by the swollen Potomac River, which could not be forded due to the heavy rains. President Abraham Lincoln, upon receiving news of the Union victory, expected Meade to pursue aggressively and destroy Lee's army before it could escape across the Potomac. In a telegram to General Halleck, Lincoln wrote, "If General Meade can complete his work, so gloriously prosecuted thus far, by the literal or substantial destruction of Lee's army, the rebellion will be over." Meade's pursuit, however, proved deliberate rather than decisive. His army, exhausted by 3 days of desperate fighting and subsequent marches through rain-soaked terrain, failed to strike Lee's vulnerable army before it recrossed the Potomac on July 14th. Lincoln's disappointment was profound. "We had them within our grasp," he lamented. "We had only to stretch forth our hands, and they were ours." The battle's immediate aftermath extended beyond military considerations. News of the Union victory at Gettysburg, coupled with reports of the fall of Vicksburg to General Ulysses S. Grant on July 4th, electrified the Northern populace. After months of defeats and disappointments, the twin victories seemed to vindicate the Union cause. According to reporting in the New York Times from July 1863, "The rebellion has received a blow from which it cannot recover. The backbone of the monster has been broken." Meanwhile, the citizens of Gettysburg faced the grim task of clearing their town and surrounding farmlands of the detritus of battle. Thousands of dead horses were burned in great pyres that smoldered for days. Farmers found their fields rendered temporarily useless by the trampling of tens of thousands of men and horses, to say nothing of the tons of lead that had been fired into the soil. Most sobering was the task of burying the dead. Despite the best efforts of burial details from both armies, thousands of bodies remained uninterred for days after the battle, decomposing rapidly in the summer heat. The stench of death hung over the region for weeks. By late July 1863, as the armies moved southward to resume their deadly dance in Virginia, Gettysburg began its transformation from battlefield to memorial landscape. The process began humbly, with local attorney David Wills proposing a proper cemetery for Union dead. Governor Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania endorsed the plan, appointing Wills to oversee the creation of the Soldiers' National Cemetery on Cemetery Hill. The recovery and identification of the dead proved a monumental task. Despite the efforts of Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the innovative medical director of the Army of the Potomac, many soldiers had been hastily buried in shallow graves marked only with crude wooden headboards, if marked at all. Thousands lay in anonymous graves that would never be identified. The work of disinterment was as sorrowful as it was necessary, records the Congressional Globe of 1864. Bodies in various states of decomposition were carefully exhumed, with workers making every effort to preserve identifying information found on the remains. By autumn, the new cemetery was taking shape on the very ground where Union forces had withstood the Confederate onslaught. The design, created by landscape architect William Saunders, arranged graves in a great semicircle, with soldiers grouped by state radiating outward from a planned central monument. On November 19, 1863, thousands gathered for the cemetery's dedication. The featured orator was Edward Everett, former president of Harvard University, and one of America's most celebrated public speakers. Everett delivered a 2-hour oration recounting the battle in meticulous detail and placing it within the broader context of world history. President Lincoln, invited almost as an afterthought to provide a few appropriate remarks, followed Everett with his immortal Gettysburg Address, just 272 words that redefined the meaning of the war and indeed of the nation itself. In his brief speech, Lincoln transformed the battle from merely a military victory to a test of whether a nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, could endure. "The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here," Lincoln stated with unintended irony, "but it can never forget what they did here." The process of commemoration accelerated in the years following the war. Veterans organizations from both North and South began erecting monuments to mark the positions where their units had fought. The first was placed by the 1st Minnesota Infantry in 1867, commemorating their devastating charge on July 2nd that helped stabilize the Union line but cost the regiment 82% casualties, the highest regimental loss in a single engagement in American military history. By the 1890s, hundreds of monuments dotted the battlefield, creating what historian Thomas A. Desjardins calls a landscape of memory. The Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, formed in 1864, worked to preserve significant portions of the battlefield from development and mark important tactical positions. The reconciliationist spirit of the late 19th century found powerful expression at Gettysburg. The 25th anniversary reunion in 1888 brought together thousands of aging veterans from both sides, culminating in a reenactment of Pickett's charge, where former enemies met at the stone wall not with bayonets, but with handshakes and embraces. Perhaps most poignant was the 50th anniversary in 1913, which drew more than 50,000 veterans, their average age now over 70. President Woodrow Wilson addressed the gathering, praising the assembled veterans as men who had given a nation its freedom and self-possession. According to contemporaneous accounts in the Philadelphia Inquirer, gray-bearded men who had once tried to kill each other wept openly as they clasped hands across the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge, the memory of their fallen comrades more vivid than their former enmity. The commitment to preservation eventually led to the establishment of Gettysburg National Military Park in 1895, ensuring that future generations could walk these hallowed grounds and contemplate the sacrifices made there. Historians and military students from around the world came to study the battle, analyzing the decisions made by commanders on both sides. Gettysburg became a case study at the U.S. Army War College, with officers walking the terrain to better understand how geography influenced tactics and strategy. The battlefield's significance transcended purely military interest, however. For many Americans, Gettysburg became sacred ground, a place of pilgrimage where the nation's most cherished ideals had been defended at terrible cost. The preservation of the Union and the eventual abolition of slavery gave retrospective meaning to the carnage, transforming what Lincoln called these honored dead into martyrs for a cause greater than themselves. As the 20th century dawned, Gettysburg had secured its place not only in American military history, but in the nation's cultural identity. The battle that neither army had planned, fought at a rural crossroads in Pennsylvania, had indeed become the turning point that changed the fate of the American Civil War, and by extension, the nation itself. The strategic significance of the Confederate defeat cannot be overstated. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, which had seemed nearly invincible after its victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, suffered losses it could never fully replace. Over 28,000 casualties, including many irreplaceable field officers and veteran soldiers. Though the war would continue for nearly 2 more years, the Confederacy would never again mount a major offensive operation into Northern territory. Gettysburg marked the point where the war's momentum shifted decisively, asserts military historian Alan C. Guelzo in his work, Gettysburg, The Last Invasion. Though Grant's capture of Vicksburg on July 4, 1863 secured Union control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy, it was the defeat of Lee, the South's greatest general and most potent symbol, that truly signaled the beginning of the end for the Confederate cause. Beyond its military impact, Gettysburg transformed the character of the war itself. Lincoln's address at the cemetery dedication reframed the conflict from a struggle merely to preserve the Union to a new birth of freedom that would make real the promise of equality embedded but unfulfilled in the founding documents. The battle's enduring place in American memory owes much to the eloquence of participants and witnesses who recorded their experiences. From Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's stirring accounts of the defense of Little Round Top to Lieutenant Frank Haskell's detailed narrative of Pickett's charge, these first-hand testimonies brought the drama and pathos of those 3 July days to generations who had not witnessed them. The technological innovations of the era also contributed to Gettysburg's lasting imprint on the American consciousness. Alexander Gardner and his team of photographers arrived shortly after the battle, capturing images of bloated bodies in the summer heat that shocked Northern civilians accustomed to romanticized depictions of warfare. These stark images, reproduced in publications throughout the North, brought home the human cost of the conflict as no written account could. According to the Washington Evening Star of July 1863, these photographs should be seen by every man who still harbors illusions about the glory of battle. They speak a truth no pen can adequately convey. Tourism at Gettysburg began almost immediately after the battle and grew steadily through the decades. By the early 20th century, it had become a significant industry for the town, with guides, many of them veterans in the early years, leading visitors through detailed accounts of the fighting. The construction of the electric railroad in 1921 and the growth of automobile tourism further increased visitation. The battlefield's educational value led to its increasingly sophisticated interpretation by the National Park Service, which took over management in 1933. Generations of American schoolchildren have walked these fields on class trips, absorbing lessons about courage, leadership, and the fragility of national unity. Gettysburg's significance continues to evolve with America itself. During the Civil Rights Movement, activists invoked Lincoln's words at Gettysburg to highlight the unfinished work of equality. A century after the battle, Martin Luther King Jr. would stand before the Lincoln Memorial and begin his "I Have a Dream" speech by referencing the Gettysburg Address. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The battlefield has hosted presidential visits throughout American history, from Lincoln's address to Dwight D. Eisenhower, who maintained a farm adjacent to the battlefield, to more recent commemorations. Each administration has found in Gettysburg's story elements that speak to contemporary challenges. Military professionals continue to study the battle for insights into leadership, decision-making under pressure, and the interplay of terrain, technology, and tactics. International visitors, particularly military officers from allied nations, regularly tour the battlefield to extract lessons applicable to modern warfare. Archaeological work on the battlefield continues to yield new insights. Metal detectors have located previously unknown burial sites and recovered artifacts that help researchers better understand soldiers' experiences. Ground-penetrating radar and other technologies allow non-invasive examination of terrain features that influence the fighting. According to the Journal of American Military History, recent archaeological findings at Gettysburg have revised our understanding of how some units were positioned and how the fighting unfolded in certain sectors of the battlefield. Perhaps most powerfully, Gettysburg reminds us of both the terrible cost of national division and the resilience of the democratic experiment. The battle stands as testament to the sacrifices made to preserve the Union and expand its promise of freedom, a cautionary tale and an inspiration. As the nation continues to grapple with questions of unity and equality, the crossroads town in Pennsylvania, where armies clashed in the summer of 1863, remains a touchstone, a place where Americans can contemplate their shared past and consider the ongoing work of creating a more perfect union. In the words attributed to Joshua Chamberlain, who survived his wounds at Gettysburg and went on to accept the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, "In great deeds, something Abides. On great fields something stays. Forms change and pass, bodies disappear, but spirits linger, to consecrate ground for the vision place of souls. The spirit of Gettysburg, its tragedy and triumph, its heroism and horror, continues to consecrate that Pennsylvania ground as a vision place for the American soul.